Greetings, Herle Burlyites. I'm going to get right to it today on account of the fact that our guest is involved in a pursuit that has him scheduled tighter than me when I'm 3 Lemon Heart rum and cokes in on a Friday night at the lake. I'm just chuffed that Jean Charest is with us here on the Herle Burly. I'm not going to do a bio here. You all know Mr. Charest, his political backstory, and his contributions to our national and regional lives in Canada, which continue to this day. So today is mostly going to be a contemporary conversation. We're going to talk about what he's trying to accomplish running for the leadership of the Conservatives, what his concerns are, where he sees the future of the party, and what he thinks about our current Prime Minister and what he'd do differently if he were leading the country. Jean Charest, welcome. It's such a pleasure for me to have you on the podcast. I really thank you for taking the time right in membership cutoff week.
Thank you, David.
So, how are you enjoying the rigors of the campaign trail? It's a glamorous life, isn't it?
It is. It's interesting. It's always, it's interesting because, David, as you know, you get to travel the country and meet a lot of people and old friends, new friends. And that part of it is always very, very rewarding because it's such a great place. The campaign, though, is different from anything I've experienced in the past. I mean, there's 5, 6 candidates up there on the stage, and the tone of the campaign has not been the one I was expecting. I thought we would have much more policy discussions during this leadership campaign, but that has not been the case. And I've tried very hard to do 2 things: be on the ground and be content oriented also, because even if it isn't a full-fledged campaign, there's a minimum that you need to put forward during a leadership race that says, here is where I stand on a number of issues. That may not be granular, but at least you need to tell folks what you would do. Otherwise, what's the point? But this campaign has taken on, after 3 debates, a very different tone. And one that I wasn't expecting, but so be it. I mean, you learn to deal with the hand that you're dealt, and to try to do the best you can. And we're feeling good about where we are at this point in the campaign, David. We're not feeling, we sort of had a path where we thought if we're able to work in areas where our vote is efficient, it's 100 points per riding. And if Mr. Poilievre is not winning on the first ballot, then we have it within reach. And I don't see him winning on the first ballot.
Interesting. Let me yank you back if I could. I said I don't want to spend a lot of time on the past, but there is a question I've always been interested in about you. Which is, let's go back to the early 1980s. You're in your early 20s.
Yep.
Okay. The Liberal Party has just won 74 out of 75 ridings in Quebec.
Yes.
And the lone other person is a Conservative named Roch LaSalle, who managed to hold on to his own riding for similar reasons that you held on to your riding, I presume, in 1993.
Yep. Yes.
So why did you run as a progressive Conservative? That is not what young, ambitious people did in Quebec in the early 1980s.
Well, David, I come from a Conservative family. My father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather were Conservatives. And it was just in the blood, in the family. And that was true both provincially and federally. I'll give you an example. My grandfather, whose name was Ludovic, organized for Maurice Duplessis when Duplessis was chosen leader of the Conservative Party of Quebec in 1932 at the Magog Hotel on Dufferin Street in Sherbrooke. And he goes way back. And that's part of it. But also in the early 80s, here we have a Liberal government that has run its course, frankly. And, anyone who had an instinct about politics, or folks who had an instinct, understood that. And we were due for change. The other part of it, David, is I liked Joe Clark a lot. I think we underestimate the extraordinary contribution that Joe made to the country. Joe was the MP and the leader from Alberta who had learned French and understood Quebec and had made an extraordinary effort to reach out to Quebec. Yeah. I think the country owes him a lot. He said the signal he sent was quite powerful. So in the leadership race of 83 between him and Mulroney, I didn't know Mulroney. I supported Joe and organized for Joe. We lost that leadership race. I came back to Sherbrooke. I'm a young lawyer. I have friends who I'd worked with who said you should run. The Mulroney gang didn't want me as a candidate, and I had a very good adversary. We had a big nomination meeting. 2,000 people showed up. This is on 15th of May, 1984, David, a sign of what was coming. And I won by 100 votes. And so that was the beginning of it. But from the get-go, I was running against my own party in that respect. And obviously things changed after that. But I was schooled pretty early on in my career of beating the odds.
There you go. So let's move from one odd decision, which panned out for you, to another odd decision, which is you're 10 years out of politics. You've got a private life. And people who haven't been an elected politician don't know what I'm referring to. You can't possibly know. But there is no private life. There's no personal time when you're at a senior level in politics. You had a comfortable income. I don't know how much you were making, but you're a lawyer at a big firm and you sat on some boards. You were successful. People wanted your advice and counsel. And then you give all that up to run for this leadership, for this job. Why did you do that?
Well, let me return to when I left politics. When I left after 28 years, half of it federal, half of it provincial, I was asked whether I had any regrets. I remember thinking, trying to find an interesting answer to give. I said, had I been offered in 84, I was 25 years old. Had I been told, Jean, you can be a billionaire, or here's the 28 years of your life ahead of you. There's no doubt in my mind I would have chosen those 28 years, even with all their ups and downs, because you only live once, David. You only live once. You can only drive one car at a time. You can only, I want my life to be significant. So here I am, 10 years into the private sector, and I see a country that is divided. The country's deeply divided right now. I think our economy is at sea. I mean, unemployment is low, but we have labor shortages, and I don't see a policy of economic growth in the country. Internationally, our voice is diminished. And I think I can lead the party, and I do think that millions of Canadians who are political orphans right now, there's a lot of them out there, are looking for a national alternative to the Conservatives, and one that's fiscally conservative with a solid economic plan. And if we get that right and we form a national government, there's a lot that we can do. So that's why I'm running. The deep love for the country is a way to put it.
Excellent. Okay, well, let's get right into it. What is fundamentally wrong with the Trudeau government?
I think its economic policies are all on the spending side, not on the growth side. And coming out of COVID, for example, I think we were expecting a much better guidance and plan on how we should clean up our balance sheet, do it in an orderly fashion, by the way, which is what I believe we should do. We shouldn't try to balance our order or balance sheet or balance our budgets by breaking everything along the way. I'm not of that school. But what we have instead is a government that's very bent on spending and without much of a guidepost on how we should orient the country. That's what I see. The other part is that the country is divided. We are balkanized. On resource development, for example, I believe in resource development. That includes oil, gas, pipelines, and mining. I did a plan called Plan A when I was Premier of Quebec. And the government is just not, doesn't believe in that. And I think it's wrong-headed. And I'll give you a real-time example. I never heard Mr. Trudeau stand up, except for Trans Mountain, maybe, and say, I believe in this pipeline project. We need to get it done because it's right. That never happened. That you and I know from experience that none of these big projects get done without leadership. And someone has to grab the ball and run with it. And those are the things that I think are wrong. And on the international scene, frankly, our voice is much diminished. More recent example is Biden's trip to Asia, where he's now created the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, invites 13 other countries to join it, and Canada is not even mentioned. I mean, that speaks volumes of our place in the world right now. We are a Pacific country. I can't see the reason why we would not have been invited to this grouping, frankly. It's not a trade agreement. It seeks to deal with 4 specific issues, all of them relevant to Canada, but yet we're not even there. We're not at the table. So there's a lot of examples of where Canada's leadership in the world is missing, and where I think a conservative government that has its priorities right can make a big difference for the country.
Let's talk about a couple of truisms of living through these last 2 pandemic lockdown years. Our ability to move about freely was severely restricted. We've been hyper-focused on our own health. And the two are related. Think of how you accessed your doctor or how you filled a prescription during those lockdown periods. Not shockingly, COVID-19 dramatically increased the demand for all kinds of digital health services, particularly virtual care. TELUS is our presenting sponsor. They created their TELUS Health business 13 years ago, and since that time, it's grown into Canada's leading provider of digital health technology and primary care. I'll give you some staggering numbers to chew on in just a second. But as a company rooted in social purpose, TELUS Health is aligned with TELUS's mission. That is to use their world-leading technology in a way that's not only good for business, but good for people in the world. That means a seamless flow of health information and systems that allow Canadians the opportunity to play an active role in managing their health. I'm a pollster. I know how numbers can powerfully tell a story, and these ones really speak to the changing nature of how we get the care we need. In 2021 alone, there were 551 million digital health transactions through TELUS Health. What the devil is a digital health transaction, you ask? So did I. Well, it's everything from visiting your doctor virtually, to processing your health insurance claims, to enabling care teams to remotely monitor patients at home, to your doctor managing your health through an electronic medical record and shipping medications to your doorstep with virtual pharmacy service, to physiotherapists and other allied providers processing e-claims so you're not out of pocket for health benefit expenses. Last year, 1.1 million more Canadians started using TELUS Health virtual care, bringing the total number to just a hair under 3 million. And when you add in all the Canadians supported by TELUS Health, that number balloons to 19.3 million. Herle Burlyites, that's more than half the population. TELUS' focus on how its technology supports Canadians across the full continuum of healthcare falls under their ESG commitments, environmental, social, and governance, which you can read more about in their sustainability and ESG report at telus.com/sustainability. Let's pick up on that last thread. What do you think's happened to Canada internationally in the sense that when Trudeau was elected, and you may not agree with this assumption, but when Trudeau was elected, I thought that, first of all, he was probably the most famous Canadian Prime Minister there had ever been. No offense to Mr. Mulroney or to his father, Pierre Trudeau, but I think around the world, Justin Trudeau probably better known than any Canadian Prime Minister in history. And you know, at the beginning, he and his team and the Obama people were pretty much having sleepovers. They were so close. And so what do you think's happened?
Well, it's interesting. The notoriety factor did play. You may remember he attended, I think, an Asia Pacific meeting, an APEC meeting was it in South Korea? And all these young girls at the airport are, you know, it's as though one of the Beatles had gotten off the plane or something. He hasn't said anything. He hasn't done anything. And so good for him. I mean, you know, fine. But there's no substitute to substance. And what I think happened with Mr. Trudeau's government is that they fell into this trap of virtue signaling about a number of issues internationally. And Canada was slowly but surely not taken very seriously. There's a few episodes that speak to that. At the CPTPP meetings, which were TPP, the first version of the acronym, Trans-Pacific Partnership, which became the Comprehensive Partnership Mr. Trudeau failed to show up at that meeting of heads of governments and heads of state who waited for him for an hour. I mean, it may sound like a detail. It isn't. I mean, I tell you, put 11 members or leaders of governments who all have big egos in a room and make them wait for an hour and see what happens. They don't forget that. And then the trip to India and also other, some of them, and it's not all bad, by the way, David. It's not as though I'm saying everything Mr. Trudeau did was bad. That's because it's not true. But I don't think it was the firm grip that we saw in the years where Mulroney fought against apartheid. Jean Chrétien refused Canada's participation in the war in Iraq. Those were times where I think Canada's foreign policy was much stronger. Our voice was stronger in the world. We played a role. And then there's the missed opportunities. I'll give you other examples on vaccines, On vaccines, no developed country really took the leadership of saying we can help organize vaccines in developing countries because we have the wherewithal to do it. That would have been a made-to-measure role for Canada. Nothing happened on that front. Haiti, I'll give you another example, is within our hemisphere, suffering a great deal. We have an important diaspora, the Haitian community in Canada. Here's a country where we could play a role. We could be playing a role in helping Ukraine when they come out of the war and putting together a Marshall Plan. I mean, I see things there where Canada could, if we wanted to, and if we had the wherewithal, speak up and say, our sovereignty in the North is going to be a big issue. I think that's one of the matters on which this government has been negligent, and the same is true for our armed forces. I would build two military bases in the North, and one with a deep water port, and because of our sovereignty issues and how urgent it is for us to occupy our own territory. So those are examples of things where I think we should move and where this government has not been on the ball.
Interesting. Cool. Okay, you also mentioned pipelines. And, I have to be kind of direct with you on this. I've seen the polling in Quebec on the Energy East pipeline. In fact, I've done polling in Quebec on the Energy East pipeline. And as opinion stood when that thing was being proposed, maybe it could have been changed.
Yeah.
But as it stood, no premier would have approved that.
Well, and when I was premier, this was a subject. The project was taking shape, and I was favorable to the project. There was two concurrent projects. One was an Enbridge project that got done, by the way. I forget the name of the line, but it got done. And I did a pipeline project in Quebec when I was premier between Lévis and Longueuil. And that, for me, is a case study. When we did that pipeline project, David, I said we were going to do the project. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that we were going to do the project. The question was, how do we do it right? How do we get it right? Environmentally, but also respecting land rights. But the premier, at the time, I'm the premier, stood up and said, we're going to do this. That never happened with the federal government, with Mr. Trudeau. And then the whole thing went south without anyone in the province, no one getting up and saying, this is a good idea and let's do it. And so, of course, it all became very one-sided. But let me offer you an example of how things could have been different with a little experience. And I gave some advice to TransCanada on this. And I had made a suggestion to the provincial government and the federal and the TransCanada at the time that, and this was early on, that the Quebec Pension Fund, la Caisse de dépôt, buy part of the project, that they be part owners. And had that happened early in the process, I think it would have been very different from the polling that you saw. But there was just an abyss. There was no one actually standing up and saying this is a good idea, notwithstanding the fact that there had been Lac Mégantic, which was this is in the Eastern Townships where I'm from, by the way. My mother came from a village called Burly, very close to Lac Mégantic, so I know this area very well. And just for safety reasons.
If people knew how much oil was on the rails, they'd be scared.
Well, they would have another opinion, and we can do it safely on rails too. Lac Mégantic isn't but there was no one making that case. Actually, no one at all. Now let's look at. There's a project called GNL Québec in the Saguenay that has been turned down federally and provincially, but who knows? It may be revisited with the war in Iraq. And two issues have arisen because of the war, not in Iraq.
Ukraine.
Sorry. Yeah. The war in Ukraine. Two issues have arisen. One is security of supply, which no one thinks about but that's the job of governments. And the other one is our ability to supply the European market with ethical oil. And so maybe these projects, and that's a gas project, an LNG project, these projects may see the light of day again if they're dealt with differently.
Yeah, that whole business that Western Canadians get quite worked up about ethical oil and why are we buying from these bad people. The market had taken over the oil market completely. The stock market, the investment market had taken that over completely, and there were no nationalist considerations. They were going to cheap costs or low intensity. And you're suggesting that politics may now be coming back into the oil and gas business.
And in a way that will be positive, I think there are red lines now. And that's why in Alberta, I raised it in the Manning debate, and it was interesting. There was a moment of silence because there was this this illusion that we should be forcing the provinces to accept. And I said, you know what? The last time that happened, it was a program called the National Energy Program. Are you sure you want to go there? moment of silence, and saying, "Oh, I don't know about that." So I do think we have to respect those red lines, and we can't just, barge in and force provincial governments to accept whatever we want. But there are ways of and incentives to do these projects that would allow us to get them done. Why not the pension funds, as I mentioned earlier? I mean, if you're part owner of the project, then it's a whole different story from what we have now. And that gives you. I had an interesting experience when I was premier because we attempted to do a deal between Hydro New Brunswick and Hydro Quebec, and it was the province of New Brunswick came to us saying we're ready to sell our utility to Hydro Quebec because of the debt and the operational challenges, and we almost got it done, and then the whole thing just went south, and people in New Brunswick didn't want. But when we look back at it, David, we thought to ourselves, had we offered a piece of Hydro Quebec to New Brunswickers instead.
Right.
A great deal. Well, the point I'm trying to make is that there's more than one way to skin a cat. But you just need experienced people around the table to understand that to get these things done.
To close these things out.
Yeah.
Yeah. When the National Energy Program came out, I was the president of the Young Liberals of Saskatchewan.
Oh, wow.
And in my high school yearbook, they said it was like being the Soviet PR man in Afghanistan.
On a good day. You must have been lonely at the annual ball. You were the kid out there in the corner.
No, I was the bullied mutant, absolutely. So, cost of housing is a capital letter topic nowadays, to put it mildly. For younger people especially, the market is a merciless beast. Home prices and rents in several Canadian cities have risen to the point where they now consume an impossible portion of some people's incomes. So imagine being the parents of a special needs child. Independent living is a measure of personal dignity. The most vulnerable among us often need help. They are quite simply unable to cope with the indifferent power of market forces. Well, a group of parents in Montreal decided to act. One of them is a former employee of our sponsor, CN, and CN happens to be deeply invested in service to the communities where it operates. So when La Part à Moi was founded 10 years ago, with its mission of providing housing stability to adults with special needs, CN's community fund paid attention. The fund, which depends on donations from CN employees and pensioners, exists to help agencies like La Part à Moi. Since 2012, the fund has channeled more than $400,000 to the group, and CN itself has sent a donation of $300,000. Today, La Part à Moi has a facility in Saint-Hubert on Montreal's South Shore. Residents have their own studio apartments, and each is entitled to a place for life in the residence. How's that for an amazing guarantee? There are full-time staff, shared meals, and organized support. The goal is to enhance residents' integration into society. Simply put, La Part à Moi represents the best of Canada, and it's fair to say the facility would not exist without the dedication and generosity of CN railroaders. There's no better cause. The first thing you said about the Trudeau government was the economy. And, the thing that nobody is talking about in this country, as we get more and more excited about what we can do in terms of childcare, or what we might do in terms of dental care, or what we might do in terms of all these areas, is that economic growth in Canada has been very, very low for a long time, and is projected to be very, very low well into the future. No economist that I talk to foresee strong growth for the Canadian economy as far as the eye can see. And most of them tell us that will ultimately impinge on our standard of living and our ability to afford these things. I also don't find, by the way, that any economists I talk to have silver bullets for these things.
Yeah.
What is your diagnosis of the Canadian economic problem, and what might we want to be doing? I mean, because you pile on top of our shitty growth numbers, the energy transition, and I don't care what anybody says, that's going to be a net economic negative for this country, at least in the short to medium term. Maybe not the long term, but in the short to medium term, it will be. So what are we all going to be doing for a living in 30 years?
Well, and by the way, not everything that government does is bad. I mean, I lament this. I think you probably do this discourse of they're all good, we're all good, and they're all bad. I mean, there's things the Trudeau government did right. I'm thinking of the renegotiation of NAFTA, and it was a big mobilization of the whole country, not just them, but let's recognize that he, as Prime Minister, was able to get that done. And chambers of commerce and everyone pitched in. And that was a good moment for the country in terms of that approach. The child tax credit was also positive, reduced poverty. And so there are things that governments do that are right, and we should be able to recognize it. And part of that also is the daycare agreements signed with the provinces. I support them. In this leadership race, I'm trying to find out why Mr. Poilievre, that if he supports them, he won't answer the question. And yet they're all signed, most of them, with conservative premiers, for God's sakes, including Doug Ford, and Higgs and Scott Moe and Jason Kenney. So on these things, we should be able to have leadership, honestly, that is not just purely partisan, but Canadians appreciate the ability to recognize what's done is right. Now, about our growth, I think what you're talking about and what economists see is our demographics, which are that of a population that's growing older and will affect growth. And that's sort of inevitable unless we choose to do a number of things to change that. And among them, there is immigration, and not an easy issue because you have to make immigration rhyme with the word integration. And because if you don't, you get yourself into a lot of political trouble. And I would like Canada to be the place in the world where people want to go to, whether researchers, professionals, tradespeople, and even non-skilled labor. I would like us to be the country that the world and these skilled people want to come to, and we need them. Now, the challenge for us to succeed at that is that people who come here need to be fully motivated to integrate, and we as a country need to be fully motivated to integrate them. You need both. If you don't have both, you run a high risk of failure. I'll give you an example. France is a country that does not integrate well. The government does not integrate well. A beautiful, great country, but their failure is symptomatic of what's wrong. We in Canada do a lot better. And the route to that integration is a job, it's language, and it's integration into a community. It's also recognizing professional credentials. I did a deal with France, a Quebec, France deal, where we do exactly that. You're a doctor in France, you're a doctor in Quebec, an engineer in Quebec, an engineer in France. That's the way of the future. The other part is, we talked about daycare a moment ago. Quebec did a tremendous job of daycare policies that made it accessible and affordable and allowed women to integrate the labor market. Now, Stephen Paulus wrote a book recently, I think it's The Age of Uncertainty, where he refers to the Quebec model as being a great success economically. It reduced poverty, allowed families to make the choice of having children. Actually, the birth rate went up for a while, and the participation rate of women increased, more productivity. Those are the kind of things that are smart. And by the way, when I went into Quebec politics in '98, David, I was opposed to it. I came out saying, because I'm a real conservative, I thought it cost too much. Well, I was wrong, and proved. But once I was proven wrong, I enhanced the programs we had to great success. And then the third part is older workers, experienced workers. We call them older. We need to change our model of the labor market. It makes no sense that people are retiring in their early 60s. We should have a choice to stay on. Well, yes. Now folks are listening to us and saying, these two guys are talking to each other. This is self-interest. You bet it's self-interest. I tell folks, I'm going to work a very long time in my life because I'm healthy, I'm happy, I want to do this. Why would we retire or encourage people to retire at 62 or 3 or 4 or 5? Doesn't make sense. We need them. They want to work. They'll be healthier. Now, I'm proposing we create incentives that do not penalize people who are receiving retirement income. On the RRSPs that you have to abandon at 71 years old and transfer them into another fund, I take that away and allow people to accumulate more money for retirement. There's a whole series of things that we should be doing. So if you put all of that together, there's where you'll get the bounce in productivity, apart from the fact that you need to increase more the use of more machinery, there's a whole host of other things we have to do. But those are the things I'd like to do for the country.
On the working age, it's such an interesting idea, but it feels to me like there's a real dichotomy, Mr. Charest, between people like me who, there's no reason why I shouldn't be able to do what I do for as long as I'm mentally copacetic. But if I was a nurse or a construction worker, I bet I'd want to retire at 65. I bet my body's done. I bet, right?
Well, the French have a concept. The French are fantastic at these things. They call it, on the retirement and deferred retirement programs, they call it la pénibilité. Pénibilité. Well, how difficult it is. Pénible, something that's painful. The painfulness of work. And certain jobs are physically demanding, a construction worker, plant worker, floor. But that being said, they don't have to work 5 days a week. What if we create models in which they work because that's what they want? If you ask those same people, would you like to continue working? They'll answer yes, but I don't want to continue 5 days a week. I want to work 2 days a week or 3 days a week and pass on my experience. That's the kind of thing that we have to strive for. I did a study for the aeronautical industry in Canada, and this was 3 years ago, about the future of the industry. Now, the average age of a worker on the plant floor of one of Canada's major knowledge-based industries is 54 years old. And our recommendation to the government of Canada at the time was put in place programs that will incentivize these workers to stay on. But frankly, you have no choice. If they are all going to be retiring at 60, we are going to be in big trouble in maintaining what is one of the most important value-added industries in the country. But so those are the things: 2-3 days a week, and for those type of jobs, and you would have a net gain in our economy.
Okay. Can we talk about climate change for a second? And I don't want to get into the details necessarily of what you would or wouldn't do. I'm more interested in talking about it with you from this angle. So, the Trudeau government, frankly, has probably pushed climate action with its carbon tax, etc., as far as public opinion will allow it to push.
Yeah.
And yet, these actions are not sufficient to get Canada to where it needs to go to meet its international obligations. Yet Canada seems to me to be more serious about this than most other countries around the world.
Yes.
All of which leads me to believe that we're not going to meet as a world, as a planet, any of the targets that the scientists tell us we have to meet. All of that makes me less interested in the minutiae of the debate in Canada and more interested in, Jesus, as a citizen of the world, how am I supposed to look at and think about this?
Well, let me take the other side and offer you some encouragement, because this is an issue I've dealt with a lot in my lifetime. I was the head of Canada's delegation in Rio in 1992 when we
took Paul. You took Paul.
And Paul was there, by the way.
You took him. You put him. You included him in your delegation. He's always been very grateful about that.
But he was part of the briefings also at the time. He attended all the briefings I had with officials. And I remember Paul asking me about that. And we did. It was quite exceptional, by the way. No one knows about this, but at the time, you don't invite your critic into a private, confidential briefings. But I did. Paul asked me. I said, "Fine, let's do it." He criticized me. He attacked our, but he always did it in fairness. That was fine. And I thought that was poetic. I liked him a lot and enjoyed working with him. And then I attended a lot of COP meetings. I guess the point I want to make is that we can be successful on the environment. I want to give you two examples. The Montreal Protocol was done in 1987 under a conservative government to reduce CFCs and HCFCs in the environment that were depleting the ozone layer. It is the most successful environmental treaty in the world. It has economic instruments within it, supported by the Reagan administration at the time, and the ozone layer is being repaired. The other one is the Clean Air Act of 1990 on SO2 emissions, again with market mechanisms in it, and done with Bush father, and very successful. By the way, it pained me that conservatives are unable to claim their legacy. The point I want to make is, yes, we can find solutions, but we need to be very disciplined on the design of the programs and how we get there. We all agree that we need to reach zero emissions by 2050, and the challenge is the transition and how we get there. And in the case of Canada, it means doing a whole host of things, including developing carbon capture and storage, a new technology. We should invest in that. Hydrogen, blue and green, biofuels, small modular reactors. We're not going to get to zero emissions, David, without nuclear. And we have
100%.
We have four provinces working on what we call the SMR, small modular reactors, including New Brunswick and Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. So those are and then I would do away with Mr. Trudeau's carbon tax on consumption, and I would replace it with a levy on large emitters, because I think that's what is the most efficient and works best if you want to develop technologies that get there. The oil industry, by the way, in Patch and Alberta are on that. Alberta has had a price on carbon for large emitters since 2002. Here in Quebec, I did the carbon trading system with California, which is on large emitters also. And I think it is the best path. Now, what I have done that attracted attention, and for some environmentalists, a disappointment, was reduce Canada's commitment for 2030 from 40 to 45% to 30%. And the reason why I did that is because I want to...
Because the 45% commitment had been pulled out of somebody's ass without any plan to get there whatsoever?
Voila. I couldn't have... You know where it came after a meeting between John Kerry and I think Mr. Trudeau, and the Americans committed to 50% by 2030, which they're not going to. And one of the points I've been making, because I don't know whether you know of a government either in Canada, provincially or federally, who actually has met their targets.
No.
It hasn't happened. It just doesn't happen. And a press release does not reduce carbon emissions in the atmosphere, is the way I've been putting it. So why don't we stick to things that we know we can get done and actually get them done and have some credibility, as opposed to always overreaching and never really reaching the objective and creating just more cynicism. So I'm more optimistic. I think we can get it done, but it's going to require some technology and some very careful design. And you're right about Canadians, by the way. If you can't stretch it too much, because you'll lose their support very rapidly on paying. Yeah.
Especially in the current circumstance.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about politics now. When you announced your intention to enter this race, Pierre Poilievre was already a strong frontrunner. What's wrong with Pierre Poilievre being the leader of the Conservative Party?
Well, we've had 3 debates now, and every debate he's come out of it looking worse, and I think we've come out of it looking better because we're tested. You know, a leadership race, if it's done right, is a test. And political parties need to understand it that way. If you do it, that's why it's so important to do it. You're going to test drive the candidates, and they're going to be subjected to this race, and it will make them better candidates. But you'll also find out whether they are or not made for the job. If it's not done right, or it's a coronation, well, then you run the risk of making a bad choice. And even at that, parties have been known to make bad choices. And in the case of Mr. Poilievre, I still, I'm looking for his policies in this leadership race. I committed when I ran, I'm going to stay very true to myself. I believe in conservative values. I've expressed them, and I'll tell you what they are for me. It's fiscal conservatism, believing in a market-based economy, believing in economic policies that create economic growth to create more wealth for Canadians. I believe in families, plural, by the way. I believe in law and order and the rule of law. And I have an issue with Mr.
You don't mean you're a Mormon, do you?
No.
No.
And I believe in a form of federalism that does distinguish us from the federal liberals, where that is very respectful of the jurisdictions of the province. So when you put those values together, you get what I believe is to be the core values that define what it is to be a conservative in the country. And in the case of Mr. Poilievre, what I see is American-style politics, quite frankly. You know, the attacks, constant attacks, the sloganism, the polarization, hot-button politics. And I'm worried about that for good reason, because I don't think it leads to much. But also, maybe in the United States, they can get through all that. And their culture's political history is different. Everything's different. And we love our American neighbors, and we hope they'll get through it. But that kind of politics in Canada, really? I mean, at the core of that approach in politics...
What's the danger of it? What's the danger of it?
You oppose one group to the other to build a base. And if you do that, it is very, very damaging to a country like Canada. And so I don't think that's the right choice. It's not the style of politics. It's not what we want. And that's why what we're picking up on the ground is a lot of people watching this race feel it's going to be consequential for the country. It isn't just about Conservatives. Whoever we choose as leader is going to be consequential for the whole country. And after that, we have to unite the party and get our act together and elect a national government. And we need to broaden that base. And I have every confidence I can do that, and I will do that once I become leader. But in the case of Mr. Poilievre, clearly I don't see this attack dog style of politics isn't what our country needs or wants.
What do you think of the crowds he's attracting?
Well, he's attracting, let's be careful about this, by the way. I want to be careful about this. I'll tell you why. There's a lesson to be drawn from the Trump campaign against Madame Hillary Clinton. She sort of disparaged those who were supporting Mr. Trump and making a mistake of not drawing the distinction between.
It's a great phrase, though. I was just going to say, you can't agree with me, but basket of deplorables, terrible political line. Just a great phrase, though.
Yes, and very, very badly. But because why? Here are people who are suffering and who are not feeling good about themselves or their lives. They may have lost their jobs. They may have lost their home. They may, their kids are not doing well, and they're suffering. And Mr. Trump, whether intentionally or by instinct, acknowledges them, and they supported him. Now, in the case of Mr. Poilievre, I'm not saying that's always the case, but there are a lot of people in those rooms who are also unhappy. And we saw that in the convoy movement, which is legitimate. I mean, people are allowed to protest. And God knows in my life, I've been on the other side of those protests. And I want to live in a country where people are allowed to protest, but we're not allowed to do blockades. And we're not allowed to cause other Canadians to lose their jobs and close down plants and have hundreds of millions of dollars lost in the economy. And if you are a legislator, a person who makes laws for others and changes laws for others, you don't have the option of treating the laws of the land like a buffet table from which you choose what you like or don't like. And that's a failure of leadership. And if you can't stand up to that test, well, then I think that's a real failure of leadership. And that's where I think Mr. Poilievre falls down. I think that's unacceptable. And why does he do that? Well, because it's popular. Because he senses it's popular. Well, sometimes in politics, you have to accept the fact that you have to do things that are unpopular. I did that on Bill 21 in Quebec. It wasn't called 21 at the time, but it was presented to me when I was premier to outlaw religious symbols, and I said no. And it would have been much more popular for me to do it, but it was wrong. And so I said no. But that's, I can get up every morning and look at myself in the mirror and say, I did what I believe in. And I'm running this leadership race. The policies I'm putting out there, all things that I believe in, I'll stand by them. And members of the party will make their choice. But I'm confident they'll want a leadership that's been tested. The other thing that I hope that people will like or be interested in is it would be a breath of fresh air to have a prime minister in Canada who's been a premier of a province. I think that would
never happened. It's never happened.
No, not an elected one. At least there's been a few that were not elected way back,
Yeah.
For a very long period of time. But I
no
think
Quebecer has ever tried, as I understand. I don't think.
No, this will be a first, which is, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, to Poilievre's crowds again for a second. I'm in the polling business, as you know, and there's a lot of angry men out there these days. I don't really know why, especially young men. There's a lot of anger out there. He may be speaking to them unhelpfully, but somebody needs to be speaking to them, right?
Yes, you're right. And your instinct is right and mine is right. The mistake that some people would make was just to say, well, they're angry and we're not, and discount them. No. They're angry for a reason. It is our duty to understand what those who are angry about, what it is that in their life and about their country that they are unhappy with, and what we need, and to be listened to and to address that. And we know part of the story is, of course, it's COVID. People are tired and they're frustrated and they feel they've been restrained. That adds to it. But the other part of it, David, is that the job of political leaders is not to fan anger, is not to feed it, but rather to understand it and to listen and to respond with well thought out policies. It's not enough just to go out there and entertain that anger and just that for me is exactly the wrong approach. As we all have a choice in politics, we can speak to the lowest common denominator and actually cultivate the feelings of people who are suspicious, or it's like these theories of complice. How do you call it? The conspiracy theories. Mr. Poilievre is signaling into the direction of those who think the World Economic Forum is some sort of a plot for. Which is, of course, it's not. But by saying my ministers will not go there, otherwise they'll be fired, it's all a signal to the conspiracy theorist. I don't know what he'll do with his ministers. He won't send them to the Chamber of Commerce in Toronto, or keep them in the basement of the House of Commons so that they don't go out. No, don't let the ministers out today. Keep them in the basement. So, I mean, I'm exaggerating, but frankly, do you ever see that? A government say, no, you can't go there. I'm the prime minister. You can't go to this meeting or this because we don't like what they're saying. I mean, they can say whatever they want at the WEF. If I'm Canada's prime minister, I'm a sovereign country and I'm going to do whatever I think is right in the end for my country. I don't care what the WEF thinks or doesn't think.
All right, so we're right down to the short strokes on this thing, and I don't really bring up a shitty memory for you, but go right ahead. Here's how I recall 1993, and I'm sure it was much more nuanced than this, and I may get a detail or two wrong, but Mulroney resigns, and for some reason, everybody in the cabinet, or most of the cabinet, decide that Kim Campbell is the obvious replacement. And the whole party lines up behind Kim Campbell, and at some point, people convince you to enter the race, really just to give it some interest, I think, as much as goddamn anything. And of course, you out-campaign the hell out of her. And by the time the convention happens, everybody understands that you're the right choice and she's the wrong choice, except the delegates were selected months ago, and the membership cutoff was even more months ago. So it really didn't matter what people thought by the end of the race. Are you worried about parallels? I mean, people say you're so far behind on the memberships.
I'm not. I do see the parallel, and yes, there are some parallels. And it's human nature. It's both good and bad in the sense that once people have committed to a candidate, they feel they're committed and they stick to that person, even though the campaign demonstrates that the other candidate may be better. So it has a positive part to it. They want to be loyal and keep their word. And then the other part is that, frankly, once the race, which is a test, we were talking about that earlier, demonstrates that there's a better candidate, those who are more thoughtful do change and say, well, listen, I want to make the right choice for the country. In this case, there's a lot of layers of complexity. It's 100 points per riding. So 1,000 members in a riding in Alberta is worth the same as 100 members in a riding in New Brunswick. It's worth the same thing. And so there's an issue of efficiency of the vote. The other thing about the format of this race, which is a preferential ballot, you may indicate your first and second and third choice or down the line to the sixth. is that the front runners in the two previous races under this format lost because they top out after the first ballot. So if Mr. Poilievre is not winning on the first ballot, then he's losing, and we're it. And I don't see him winning on the first ballot.
You don't seem like an obvious person for Leslyn Lewis's votes to go to.
Yes and no, because we all have our positions. You know, on social conservatives, I have my own view, born from experience. You know, who are the social conservatives of this country, if not people whose life is faith-based? They believe in their families and their community. You know what, David? They're good people. These are very good people. They don't just, I know because of the issues, they don't want to be demonized, and they want to be treated with respect. So, and everyone understands that a political party is not a sect. It's like-minded people working on the same values and who share same core values. And then on issues, different issues, you may or may not get your way. But most of all, they want to be respected. So I get along well with her. I quite like her. And in the debates, I think she's been good. And actually, she's been attacking Mr. Poilievre as much as anyone else. So who knows where that will lead us.
Right. Listen, you've generously shared 45 minutes of your time with us in a crazy, crazy week for you. Thanks for doing it.
Can I ask one? If your listeners want to support my leadership race, go to jeancharest.ca. Buy a membership, please.
Did you hear that? jeancharest.ca, right? I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS. I'd like to thank our sponsor, CN Rail. I'd really like to thank Jean Charest for being here today. And jeancharest.ca gets you a ticket to the show.
Thank you, David. Great to
Take
talk.
care. Good luck. Great talking with you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Herle Burly, Herle Burly.